Let's see, come on in.
Okay. Are you saying?
No.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
Are you gonna take a break for the eclipse?
I hadn't thought about that.
It's 13 after.
Oh, it's now?
That's why I'm sitting here.
I thought we don't mind taking. a
No,
break.
we don't.
It's at 1:15. I don't think it's gonna be very long.
No, it's not really. I just got a couple of irises. Looks like irises.
No, if you would.
I want to do this. It's a warm one.
Okay.
Thank you, Rich. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Scott Moore. I'm here with the Marshall Native Gardens and the Madison County Garden Club. I'm here to introduce Alan to you. Alan Smith spoke to the Garden Club last year, and it was so captivating. Everybody came out of there with a renewed enthusiasm for azaleas because the gentleman is a wealth of knowledge, and we all went and out and bought a ton of azaleas. Alan Smith is a retired professor of biology at Mars Hill University. He was educated at the University of South Alabama and East Tennessee State University. He's primarily trained in ornithology, and he's done research and taught courses in ecology, mammalogy, and botany. He's done lots of field work for various organizations and government agencies, conducting surveys for rare or endangered plant and animal species. Alan got into this because he was long enamored with collecting and growing a variety of plant species, especially the deciduous rhododendrons, azaleas, trillium, and other liliaceous species. And he is here to share his knowledge of native azaleas and tips for growing them. He is from the Beach Glen area, right here in Madison County. So I introduce you to Alan Smith.
Thank you, Scott. Well, it's a pleasure to be here to give you some information from my experience in growing a group of plants that many people are somewhat familiar with, but kind of goes under the radar in many ways. And it's a group of plants, the azaleas, the native azaleas, that I've been absolutely besotted with for a number of years. And it's something that I've devoted quite a bit of time and effort to. And it's been a real pleasure of mine to sort of learn about and collect as many of them as I can. So I've got a pretty good collection. I wouldn't call it a garden. It's more of a, throw it out there wherever is available spot kind of approach. And I have more than I probably should have, but I really do enjoy it. So I hope I give you some information that could get you a little bit excited about them and see what you can do. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the subject we're talking about here, these native deciduous azaleas, and put in parentheses rhododendrons. So there's all four of those words have some explanation needed there. By native, we've already heard, some of you have heard other presentations today, heard a little bit about what that means. And it is difficult to say exactly what native means. As Carrie talked earlier about, you could be talking about North America, you could be talking about the East, North Carolina, Western North Carolina, Madison County, whatever. And every level, you can make the case that defines native, or in some cases not defining it very well. But for this, I think of this primarily as species of azaleas that live naturally within the southeastern U.S., essentially from eastern Texas to Virginia and through up into the southern Appalachian Mountains. That's the general range of this group of plants. And they are native there. They're growing there on their own, and you can find them if you wander the woods. That's the kind of way I think of native in this context. Deciduous is obvious. These are azaleas, plants that lose their leaves in the winter. They drop all their leaves. And many azaleas that you know about or see for sale or read about are non-deciduous. They're evergreen. And when you go and buy azaleas from Lowe's or places like that, you're likely to get some of the non-deciduous evergreen azaleas. And those are fine plants, but they're not the native things that we're talking about here. The term azaleas is really an older term. And for many years, that's the way people thought of them. They were special because they were azaleas, and they were different from rhododendrons, which many people are more familiar with. But in recent years, the taxonomists that look at these sort of things have decided that, in fact, that they should be lumped together as one big group and all called rhododendrons. So everything that you might have learned about as an azalea is really a rhododendron. And that's the current status of the taxonomy, the naming of all these plants. That's just simply a way of saying that they're very closely related. Now, there are distinctions, and we can say that among all rhododendrons, the native azaleas, the deciduous azaleas, I should say, are a very small portion. So in the world, there are something on the order of 850 species of rhododendrons. Most of them are probably Asian, even Himalayan region is where you would see the bulk of those. And out of those 850, I don't know the number, but it's probably less than 100 species. A very small fraction are deciduous. And because of that deciduous versus evergreen kind of easy mark, that's the distinction that we can commonly see. There are other technical differences between the deciduous azaleas and the other rhododendrons, but we won't need to get into that. But rhododendrons are what we're talking about, but let's call them azaleas because that's the common parlance for that. So
Down there.
there we go. All right, so looking at the region I've mentioned, sort of the southeastern US, we've got about 16 species of native deciduous azaleas. That's a quibbleable number. Some people would say, well, there ought to be a split in some of them, maybe make another new species out of it, or maybe we should have lumped those together. People will argue of this. Botanists are likely to argue about names and groupings and things like that. But so here's the ones that we've got. And I've just lumped these in a couple of different ways to define them or to characterize them. One way we can look at is that some of them are in is by color. Some of them are in what I would think of as the red, orange, yellow range of colors. And those will vary quite a bit. And they're ones that most people are familiar with that know any of the deciduous azaleas. That's the group that they're likeliest to know about. But there are a lot of them that are also very, very much just pink, not red at all, but pink, distinct pinks. I'm red colorblind, so red colors and pink colors are a little bit of a mystery to me. But these are well-defined pinks. And then there's a whole group that are white, and some of them have colors additional to that, like a blotch of yellow color in addition to that. But we can say basically three groupings by color are a way that we see our azaleas of 16 species. The other thing that I put up here is that we can distinguish between those that are southeastern in a very broad sense. So most of these azaleas are common in central Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, up to North Carolina. But that kind of Piedmont range is a good way to say that's the center of native deciduous azaleas. And I just call that the Southeast in general, or other than the Southern Appalachians, which I've listed as SA. as a Southern Appalachian. So those are ones that, essays are ones that we have here growing native and wild in Western North Carolina somewhere. Some are more common than others, but they're here as natural parts of the area. And a third way that I like to think about these plants is by one of their special characteristics, and that's the fragrance. And if you know these plants in flower, if you smelled them, you won't forget what that aroma is like. It's just a very, very pleasant, sort of incredibly wonderful smell. It really is. And interestingly enough, not all of them are fragrant, including the flame azalea, which is the one most common in this area, and one that most people know about. It's not fragrant. Why that's so is not easy to discern, but that's the case. A very close relative of it is the southern flame azalea, which is somewhat, but not very much. So question mark. It's fragrant. So that's a good way to kind of categorize the native azaleas. And then there are a few that are very fragrant. I've just listed it as F+ fragrant to the max. And those species are something that if you're looking for something and that fragrance characteristic is attractive to you, those are the ones that I would go down there and buy some that are for sale today if that's it. And they're quite wonderful. All right. The other thing I'll say on this slide is that I haven't listed any of the scientific names, and many people sort of worry about scientific names. They don't want to go there. It's too hard, so forth. But I would remind people that you already know one. Rhododendron is a kind of scientific name, and that's not any harder than your friend Josephine or Charlie or whatever. You know, the names are not hard if you just focus a little bit. And these names are things that you will run across as listed, but if you're interested in them, you really need to know something about those Latin names. You already know half of each one of the names, rhododendron, whatever. You already know that. So don't worry, just try harder and you'll get to those things. Okay, so just a little bit about the structure of these plants that are important if you're trying to distinguish between them, or if you are looking for subtle aesthetic qualities, which to me is one of the best things about this group. It's not that they're big and bursting forth with color or structure. It's that they have subtle characteristics that when you look closely add to the appreciative value, I think, of this group of plants. That would include the fragrance, but also some structural things. So if we look at these, this would be a good example of a cluster of bloom, which is characteristic of these. If we were to go to the extreme of rhododendrons, we might see that as a truss, is a term that you might have run across, and that's what those big balls, the head of the rhododendrons, really a bunch of them packed together. That's common in the rhododendrons, not so much in the azalea end of that. And so this is kind of a loose cluster, and I think that's important. A couple of other structures that are important. Look here, and you see this kind of side view of the stamens and the pistils, the male and female parts of the flowers are pretty dramatic in many of the deciduous species. And they're quite useful in identification. So they might be, this picture doesn't show it, but they might be that the tip of the female part, the stigma, is bright red. And that contrasts with the white of the petals in that species, which is not this particular one. But it can be a very dramatic subtlety, if that is not too much of a contradiction, in the beauty of those plants and useful in identification. The other thing to note is that this one in particular has all these little hairs that you probably can see even back there. And those hairs are tipped with a gland of usually scented aroma. And so that's often what makes the smell of the flowers, not just the inside part. Everybody wants to put their nose in the flower, but in fact, you always put your nose next to the side of it, and that's where the thing is, or rub your finger on it, and you get the release of those aromas. So the structures are important. This would be the tube of the flower, and you'll see a difference between the species in how long that is or how wide open the petals are versus semi-closed. The flare or open is often a characteristic of that. Okay, so,
Which one is that?
So that is the Rhododendron atlanticum, the coastal azalea, and which is not all that distinct from several others. It's kind of the middle of the white group with little other characteristics. Yeah, should have had that. All right, so the southern flame azalea is probably the one that you're going to see most commonly in nurseries for sale. It's an easy to grow species, and it ranges in color from yellowish to orange to red, and it's easy to grow. Grows real big plants, and quite spectacular. Pretty common. Rhododendron australis. I'm going backwards. All right, so another structural characteristic is, for many of the species, is that they have some sort of additional color mixed in, often on this particular petal, which happens to be sort of the uppermost petals. If you have the flower oriented right, it'd be the top one there. And this is a typical yellow blotch. But also notice that the backside of the opening petals is quite colorful. So when you see these and you're kind of looking at it and it's not quite open, often the color of the bloom structure is one thing, and then it changes as it opens up, and your view becomes great straight on rather than from the side. And so I like to think of this as early blooming yellow and continuing into white with some yellow still there. And in pink species, the tubes will be bright pink and the opening flower will be white. So that it really is this double flowering pattern on there. And many of them will have this yellow blotch to one degree or another. And it often varies in size and in intensity. So it'll even show up in places like that previous. It's present, that blotch is present in this one, but it's hidden by the color of the petals, and not very dramatic. So when it's against the white, it's quite different. That happens to be the Alabama azalea right there. So there are some species that have quite a different arrangement of those flowers. This one is a big, tight cluster with large flowers in there, large number of flowers there. And this is not the way that you see most of them in the wild. This one happens to be one which has been selected from a wild example of that and then propagated so it becomes much more common in commerce or in gardens. But it's not normal to have that tight or big of a cluster in many of them. But this is pretty spectacular. And you certainly, if you're wanting a big, bright show, this would be one that would be attractive.
And what did you say that one?
I'm trying to remember, and I can't remember. It's a cultivar that I've just dropped from my brain temporarily. It came from, I can't think of it. I could think of it a little bit later, and I'll tell you when I do. All right, so I think it's a good time to talk a little bit about this. The way I think about the azaleas. First of all, I'm a scientist. I mean, that's my that's my thing. And I think about science and botany and ecology a lot. And there's a way that scientists think about that. So we're excited about natural changes, natural variation. We're excited about the genetic patterns, about the morphology, we're about the phenology, and all these kinds of technical terms or technical thinking excites me when I think about the native azaleas. Those are sort of a hotbed of interesting technical variations across the board that can be color, like I've said a little bit about so far. But also it might be things like when do they bloom? And as a scientist, that's really interesting to me because the bloom time is often related to the pollinators. So things that bloom in the spring early will have a whole different set of pollinators that are associated with it than ones that bloom in summer or in fall even. And we see that kind of variation across this group of plants, I think, in the extreme. So the bloom time for those 16 species is essentially from the 1st of April to well into September. So if you say, when do native azaleas bloom, you got a long span of time when there's some of them that are blooming. The bulk of them are spring blooming, but there are lots that go much later in the year. But why that would be, what is the reason behind that natural variation in the bloom time? That's a scientific question. That's a way that I like to think about the species. So it's part of my attraction to the group. Don't expect that many people are going to be all that interested in from that perspective. Yes, interested in that from the fact that can I have some azalea blooming in my yard all during the whole growing season? That's a different perspective, at least in my mind. Fragrance. So from a scientific standpoint, fragrance is interesting as to what chemical is it that is causing that fragrance? What's the concentration? Where does that come from? How does that attract different kinds of pollinators? How do those pollinators use that fragrance in one way or another? How are they attracted to those plants? Is it because of that fragrance, or what about those flame azaleas that have no fragrance? Are they left out of the loop in terms of pollinators? Those kinds of questions are science questions to me. The evolution and the evolution of these things is really interesting. So if we talk about the southeastern United States, we have to understand that we want to think about what's the distribution possibilities in the southeastern U.S. There's coastal plain, there's Piedmont, there's southern Appalachian Mountains. There's northern parts of that, the southern parts of that. That geographical range is a very big factor in this relatively small group of plants. Evolution-wise, we have an interesting situation in that these are pretty closely related. They're not real ancient. So we don't have to go back to the dinosaur days to see something about the evolution of the azaleas. They are different from the rhododendrons enough that we would ask the question, how and when and what from did these plants arise? What other kinds of rhododendron relationships are there? And those, again, would be the scientific perspectives. The ecological patterns, where do these things grow in the natural environments that we have? Some of those species are mountaintop, and some of those are swamp edges, and some of those are a variety of different ecological situations or habitats around that. So when I think of, personally, when I think of the deciduous azaleas, I think in those terms. All those kinds of ways in which science plays into our understanding of that group of plants. However, I will be the first to say that for me personally, that's not all of it by any means. The aesthetics of this group is as much a exciting thing to me as the scientific questions. And like I said, I'm a stone cold scientist in many ways, but the aesthetics add so much to that and vice versa. So I'm in it for both of them. And I know that many of you don't care much about the ecological or evolutionary patterns. And I also know that some of you do, because I know some scientists that are in this group already. So I think of it that as an important factor about my appreciation of this group. And I hope that other people can come to see that those two things, science and aesthetics, is a good mix, at least in this group of plants. All right, so just a few species that I think are worth talking about. This one is the pretty common flame azalea of our mountains in this region. This is the one that you could almost guarantee if you walk half a mile on a trail anywhere in the Southern Appalachians, you're going to run into this one. And if you're there at the bloom time, most of you will notice it right away. I have a hard time picking it out of the green background because of my color defective retinas. I don't see it as well unless I'm real close to it. William Bartram was one of the early naturalists in this region, and he called it flame in the woods, fire in the woods. And that's a good description of it. They will vary quite a bit in color and from pretty red to not very much red and more yellow. You can see here that the yellow blotch still, at least to my colorblind eyes, still stands out on that one petal there, different from the ones around it. You see that? Is that kind of easy to? So that's the one that you're going to see a lot of. And you can find that for sale pretty easily if you're looking for things to plant. Then this one is one of my most favorite favorites. This is the rose shell azalea. And it is interesting in that its distribution in the wild is a little different than most of the rest of them. This one does occur in North Carolina, but only in the most northwestern two counties. It's in Ashe and Allegheny County, if you know those counties up there in the northwest corner. And it's much more common up in Virginia, West Virginia. If you've ever been to a place called Dolly Sods, Dolly Sods is just covered up with rose shell azalea. It's quite spectacular. And they will grow here, and I have some in bloom, or I have some growing, and in bloom, they're quite nice. But I've had more trouble growing this one than almost any other one. And I buy a plant from a nursery and plant it, and they just don't seem to be happy most of the time. You have to nurse them along, and they eventually will do all right. But they're a tough one. For some reason, it's hard to understand. And I would like to know that from a science standpoint. Why is this one so hard? What is it about it? Question.
Is that the same as pink shell?
A good question, and is not. This is, and there's a good example of where common names are confusing in many cases. So, you know, what does that tell you? Rose shell? Well, it's not. A lot of roses are yellow or white or whatever. So, you know, it's confusing. No, that one is, pink shell is Rhododendron mazii. And that one is an interesting one because it occurs in the high mountains of Southern Appalachians, and that's all. It's not very widespread at all. But just that common name makes it confusing. And in fact, they don't look very much alike. The color is kind of similar, but the shape of the plant, the shape of the flowers, and everything is notably different in those. So it's a confusing characteristic for sure. All right, here's another one, and I like this one, this slide, because it does emphasize some of the things I've talked about earlier. Look at the size of those stamens. And isn't that spectacular? In addition to just a pretty color, I think it is. I mean, there's a structural thing there that I think is special. And when you see a bush full of these, you can't help but say, that's different from those other pink ones. It really is. Can you imagine what the pollinator of this one is? Because the pollination is going to be taking place way out here, not down in there, it's way out here at the tip. Hummingbirds. It's a big pollinator, hummingbird. So the hummingbird comes in, they're gonna go into the nectar's way down here, come in with their long bill, probing down there. In the process, they're gonna be knocking into this pollen that's out there and transferring it to the next plant. This also shows very different from one earlier slide that I had where I was talking about the sort of the tubes being vase-shaped, elongated, and this one is much shorter. They don't have much of a tube to them. And the petals are in some way wrinkled a little bit and they're rounded. So this one is quite different if you're looking at that level from many of the others. I will have to say that this is a scientific name that's a little tricky to put in your mind. Parapymenoides is not something that rolls off your tongue as easy as some of the other ones.
How do they grow around here? You said they're in the northern.
I'm sorry, which one were you at?
Pinkster,
Sorry,
Pinkster.
the Pinkster, they're definitely here. That is one. I don't see it really commonly, but it's in the region. It's not as common as some of the others. And there's a good version of that, a variety that's called purple, which is one of the most purple ones. That's a rare color, but they're there. Another one is, showed this slide earlier without the name. This is Alabama azalea. And I think of all the azaleas, this is probably the most fragrant, to go back to that characteristic. The most fragrant is Alabama, to my nose anyway. And quite common in a little bit south of here, not in the southern Appalachians.
So, question, are they challenging to grow in this area?
It's been one of the easiest ones for me to grow.
Okay, that's good enough.
But you said not so high? Do they need a lower elevation?
They seem to be doing very well at 2,500 feet. And that's much higher than their natural range in South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, where they're in the wild more commonly.
These would be considered native.
Yes. In the sense that native is including the southeastern area, not native to western North Carolina per se, but certainly happy to be here when they do well here. Then this is one of the really colorful ones that is interesting for another reason to me, and that is it is very, very limited in where it occurs. It occurs in essentially one little canyon area in Alabama and not anywhere else, but this very, very limited geographical area. Why is that? What's the explanation of that? I would say that the explanation is probably that this one was isolated in that little spot because of the advance of glaciers in the far north. So 20,000 years ago, glaciers came down as far south as southern Ohio and southern Pennsylvania, and there weren't glaciers here. But the effects of those were to push things south. And then when things retreated, this guy found a niche in that one place was where it has persisted in the last 20,000 years. So that's an evolution and ecological aspect of that.
Have you tried to grow that around here?
It grows fine, grows happily, but it's not here naturally. So it kind of illustrates the flexibility that this group generally has. They're not hard to grow. They're not really all that picky about what conditions they're under for the most part. But history, in this case, long-term history, has left this one in one tiny little spot, which is a common pattern among other organisms, not just not just this one.
You can see this in Charlotte at UNC, Charlotte's Botanical Garden, quite mature. And Zach and Amanda are selling it,
Yeah, this one is in Commerce. It's not hard to find.
but it's known as the latest blooming azalea.
It blooms for
Yeah,
me, mine bloom in August. I have another one that's not this, that blooms later. But it's an unusual example, I think, that you're right, it is generally known as the latest blooming. But it's a good thing, because by August, all the rest of the garden is pretty tired, and then to see this come into bloom, and it's great, it's great. I just have to get real close to appreciate it, I stand up close to it, and it's really great, but I walk by it from 30 feet away, and I don't even notice it's in bloom, so I have to pay attention. All right, another whole thing to think about with deciduous azaleas is the fact that, first of all, that there are a lot of variations in this group. So many of these species you can find, and people have found when they're wandering through the woods, oh, that's a really odd looking azalea. And then when you look closely, so that's just an odd looking flame azalea, or that's an odd looking coastal azalea, or whichever one it is, that it's an unusual one. This is a group that has not really settled out all of the characteristics into firmly defined characteristics. It's in flux right now still. The evolutionary process is not completed, or not further along than in as many other groups of plants. So there's this natural variation that occurs in nature, and people have been interested in those different aversions, and have frequently brought those into cultivation, taken cuttings and brought them in, and then cultivated those and made things out of those. Many of those would then fall into the category of cultivars. That is, if they've been, a natural variation has been brought into cultivation and has given a name and sold under that name, then that's what a cultivar is. It's some version that is a little bit off or different from, and many of those occur in this whole group of plants. And so whenever you see a cultivar, it'll have quotation marks around it, so it'll be Rhododendron prunifolium allen-smithii,
But it would still
Or-
be considered native?
something like. It's still considered native, but it's bordering on, if you're a purist, I'm not so sure, I would be considered,
Yeah.
it gets into that question, what is natural, what is native, what is the limits of the definition of species?
So the Native Plant Society designates it as a selection. It is naturally occurring, and now it's been isolated and sold, perhaps with a single quotation name under it, but it actually is absolutely native. It's naturally occurring.
And lots of people will argue with you and me about what the limits of that is. And so, my take is, enjoy them, just be aware of what they are, and if you're a purist, you're not gonna have as much fun as if you're willing to look at some of the good stuff. The other thing is the hybrid. So some of these do hybridize in nature. That is, naturally, they are cross-pollinated between species, and you'll get hybrids that persist. In many cases, they do quite well. So that gets to the genetics of the group, and that can be pretty complex, and it can be very difficult to figure out in retrospect. So you get this plant that's growing in somebody's yard, or that's in a pot for sale, and you can't really tell very easily whether this is a natural hybrid, an artificially induced hybrid, or a variation on that. So again, I tend to say, enjoy the ones that you see, and if you want to grow those as that, then there's no reason not to. But as a scientist, I say, wow, there's a lot of interesting genetics going on here. Let's see if we can figure out some of that. some of that stuff at all. All right, so just a few words about at least my experience with growing these native azaleas. I'm continually disappointed at the failures that I do have. So I won't say that you can just throw them into the ground and they're going to grow. But basically, there's not a big deal about growing them. They're not really that tough to grow. They're not really that exacting in the characteristics of the spot that you put them in. No big secrets that to growing them. I have several questions already today from someone asking about growing them in sun or not. And several people were kind of worried that theirs were going to be in too much sun if they planted it there. And I would have said, and I believe that there's almost no such thing as too much sun for almost all of these azaleas. They do fine in full sun if they're in pretty good soil and if they get a relative constant amount of moisture in the soil. So my problem that I have is I buy one or get one, plant it, water it, forget about it. And this drought happens to come at the same time. So I've realized, oh, I didn't water that but that first time, and it's been 3 weeks or a month. And the poor thing is now stressed and suffering and set back, and maybe it's not going to make it even if I've waited too long. And I'm guilty of that. And you shouldn't do it. Water your plants. Sun is not an issue in terms of too much sun if you have the roots in a cool environment, which means moist and mulched to some extent. That's the thing that you need, particularly starting off. The soil here in this area, most of the soils are very acidic. And that's perfect for azaleas. That's what they like. It is probably best to mix a large amount of organic matter when you have the opportunity to plant them. Mix some stuff in the soil, get the soil tilled up and mix the organic matter in with it. But it's not going to make the big difference of survival just because your soil is not perfect. That's not a real strong requirement. Organic mulch, I think, is important as much for moisture control as it is for the actual organic addition that's there. Water, water, water. And what I mean by that is mostly consistent watering if you are growing them in your yard or in your condition. Don't let them dry out. And that's sometimes hard to do. It is for me. And if you get a period of drought like we've had the last month or so, pretty much no water, no rain, much of it, then it's stressful to these plants. If they're long established, they're not going to have a problem at all. They're adapted for drying out. But if you planted it this year or last year and they hadn't had a whole lot of growth on them, water is the key. Water is really the key to taking care of them. Pruning is an important thing, I think, for native azaleas in two ways. One is that if you want bloom, which is what most people are after, you need to prune fairly commonly, fairly often. And the more you prune and keep the thing in a relatively small size, that is from head high down, and you've pruned it frequently, that is every couple of years or so, then you can keep that plant at the size that is a good size to enjoy. And it will bloom very well, maybe even better if it's pruned often.
Alan, does it-
The key is to prune it just after the bloom time. Don't prune it in the winter. Don't prune it in late summer. Prune it after it's bloomed. And that will encourage the growth and it will allow the time for those buds to set for next year. So if I look at my azaleas today, most of them have a full complement of buds for next year's bloom already. And you can see them. They're there. Obvious.
can you rejuvenate a larger, older, wild?
I'm gonna find
estate
out.
plan?
I'm gonna find out.
Okay.
One of
Okay, you
the,
was-
one of the cautions I would say about pruning is that if you do what I tend to do, and that is when it gets going, just kind of let it go, which is fine to see a 12-foot high azalea. But most of the blooms are 12 feet and I can't stretch quite that high to see the blooms, like what I'm growing it for. So, that's happened in my case. Yeah, a lot of times, you know, it's not that big and you can't, but how much you can cut out at one time is, I think, the key to that. Certainly, you can cut it back all the way down to the ground and it's gonna come back. They'll come back. Whether or not you can take a 20-year-old one, cut it all to the ground and expect it to just never miss a beat and come right on, that's kind of questionable. The rule that I've heard and seems to be pretty accurate is to cut a third, prune all the way down to whatever you want,
Mhm.
all the way to the ground if you need. And then wait and then do the next part
Yeah.
after that. Don't do it all at one time.
Mhm.
But if you're impatient, which some of us are, you want to go get it all going right way the first time, and it takes a little bit hard. But pruning is an important thing, and it will add the number of blooms over time. It is a good thing for the aesthetic enjoyment of the plants. Propagation. So many people are aware of propagation, but in this case, it is not difficult. And I think it's the way definitely to increase your appreciation. It's fun, actually, to try to make these things, make new plants. You have to pay attention and do the right procedure, but it's not hard and it's not specialized. You don't have to have big nursery equipment to make it happen. You can do it in a little container with a plastic cover on it. And if you do it at the right time, when the cuttings are appropriate, which is not just a couple of days out of the year, you can achieve success and you can grow your own that way. It's also possible and fairly simple to grow them from seed. So right now, the seeds on my azaleas, the capsules that the seeds are in, are just about reaching ripeness. Some of them have already passed. I missed a few of the early blooms already. But you can take those seed capsules and break them open, sprinkle them on sphagnum, water it, put some cover over it, and you can grow your own azaleas from seed fairly easily and fairly reliably and in great numbers if you want.
So with getting back to the cutting propagation, soft or hard cutting?
Almost right in the middle of those two stages. I think it's easier to achieve it if you err on the side of letting it go a little long, but not, hardwood cuttings you can do, but that's not as easy. That's not what you really want to try. And the other thing is when you're pruning a lot, you're getting a lot of fresher material from which to put those things.
Breeding hormone too?
Yes, that's very helpful. Breeding hormone, which is pretty easy to come by, and there are lots of different hormones that big time propagators use, but the most common ones I think are very adequate to that. I already had a couple of questions walking around today about the pest on azaleas, so it's a real issue that needs to be addressed if you're doing this. I have several kinds of pest problems. The biggest one I have is deer. Deer love azaleas. They particularly love to taunt me by waiting until the very week that they're about to burst into bloom. And then they eat them. And they'll eat every single one they can get their jaws on. So that's a big problem for me in this area. In most other areas, deer are an increasing problem. I consider them a major environmental problem, major. in natural systems and certainly in gardens. And, you know, you're sleeping, they're eating, and you're gonna get your stuff.
What will repel you?
So, I've had good success with, liquid fence, which is so commercially available, you get it in a lot of places. It's usually labeled as deer and rabbit, repellent.
What's it called?
Liquid fence. Sure, there are other brands of it. I'm not trying to promote any one, but that has been effective. And it's not that difficult. You have to spray it on, you spray it, generally, I think the instructions are spray it on, wait a week, spray it again, then you can wait a month. And if you do it again, you're probably good for months after that. So it's not hard to do that, particularly if you have only a few of them, you can do it. And my observation's been it works pretty well. You know, I'm sure there've been examples and maybe I missed spraying some parts of it, but it works pretty good, really has. The other thing that I do with early planted azaleas is to put some sort of a wire cage or mesh around them. That's very helpful, but it's, you know, that's a lot more work and maybe not so much if you have a few of them, but I would recommend that because things will get it if you're not careful. There are other pests that can be an issue. I've planted some. I come back the next day and the whole plant was jerked up out of the ground. And I came to believe it was raccoons. And I've seen it happen in a number of places. And I think what's happening is that nurseries are putting in their potting process or in their propagation process, there's some chemical that's involved in that. And I don't know if it's a bad chemical, good chemical, I don't know anything about the chemical or what it is, but there's something in that nursery pot that goes with that plant and they're digging around trying to investigate or get it out or do something. And they don't care about the plant is uprooted and laying there. It doesn't do well for a plant to be uprooted and spend 2 or 3 days in the bright sun. That doesn't do well at all. And I've lost a number of things that way. The only insect pests that I've ever seen are borers that get into the stem and will hollow out the center part of the shoots, not usually the big stems, but the little ones. And that's not a big problem. It'll knock off or ruin the tip ends, but it hasn't been a big issue for me.
How about mites?
Mice?
Mites. If it's
Mites. I
mites.
haven't had any problems
We have some
with mice.
azaleas over at Marshall Library and
Are they?
it's in a very hot, dry, they're not.
Are they the evergreen azaleas?
Yeah, oh, yeah, that's true.
That's,
They are.
they're much more susceptible
Yeah,
to, for some
that's
reason,
true.
but I haven't seen them on any of those that way. I've also it's the early stages when they're first planted that have the biggest problems. Voles will tunnel underneath and open up tunnels under the roots, which dries the roots out. They're not so much consuming them as they are exposing the roots that way. So as somebody said earlier, you know, watch your stuff. If you're alert, then you will notice these and a lot of the cases can be taken care of. Back to the liquid fence for a minute. Let's talk about chemicals, using chemicals earlier. That substance is, they call it putrefied egg whites, and several minty things in it, and garlic. So that's the mixture that liquid fence is. It's not any organic chemicals or anything like that. And so it doesn't smell very good, but deer don't like it at all. And the pests won't bother it, particularly after it's been on there and dried on it. And it's pretty rain resistant. So it's a good, effective way to do it. So lastly, how do you acquire some of these things? Well, there are a number of online sources for azaleas, mail order sources, and all you need to do is Google growing native azaleas or azaleas for sale, and you'll find different ones of that are, I've gotten some things from various sources that way. some as far away as Oregon, and had pretty good success with those. Mail order stuff is, usually, they do a pretty good job, the ones I've dealt with, pretty good job of packaging and shipping it, and I haven't had much issue with Azalea, online order, mail order from distance. Woodlanders Nursery in Aiken, South Carolina has been a source I've used, and they're got a pretty good selection. It's well cared for and well treated in the shipment that you can put down. There are two local nurseries that I know about that I've dealt with that I trust and think they're pretty good. Mountain Mist Nursery in Fairview is a small operation, but they're good people and they take care of their stuff, and they're very, very easy to work with, and they have mail order as well, but you can by appointment visit their nursery. And Carolina Native Nursery in Burnsville area in Yancey County is another one that has a lot of those. And there are several vendors here today that have native azaleas, including the one, forget the name right now at the far end, that has from Morganton, has a lot of really nice looking native azaleas for sale. You won't have trouble finding them. You might have trouble finding some of the most, some of all those species, like the primophyllum, that's not an easy one to find, but you can find any of them. And that's also the way that you get all the different cultivars and variations in the species there. There's lots of different ones that you can have, and you can make your own. You can hybridize your own azaleas and name them after your grandkids.
Do you have experience with the Piedmont in this area? Because the Piedmont azalea, because that's.
Yes, it's one of the easiest ones.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it's very easy. That's one I would recommend as a starter
Okay.
thing, for sure. I think it's probably, it's one of the more common ones in the woods too.
Oh, yeah.
It's a good one.
Where do you get the hormone root?
You can get it from a lot of nurseries and garden centers, and you can get it online, pretty easy. Quicker than you can drive 20 miles and buy it sometimes.
Talk about how much sun, but how much shade.
Shade, almost all of these will grow fine in shade. They won't be as bushy and they won't bloom as much if they're in heavy shade, but they'll survive. And sun is not, as I said, I don't think that's an issue. The issue there is in the first 2 years of getting them started good and letting them really get a foothold. And once that's it, full sun is a great place. And most of mine are a half and half. They're in kind of, less than perfect conditions. And you get kind of what you have to go with. I don't think there's a major issue with them either way. Dense shade is not gonna produce very much, bloom for you. But it's pretty, open, which will really have to be. As much sun as you can reasonably, give them, I think. So, any other questions?
I just wanted to share, if folks haven't been over to the Arboretum, there is a phenomenal native azalea garden.
It's a
there,
natural repository, it's an official repository. I agree mostly with what you said.
Okay.
The last little bit of times that I've been there, I was kind of disappointed that it didn't seem to be curated very well. They weren't taking
I
care of it as well as I would have hoped and so forth. And,
The few times I've been, they've had crews out there working, but I see where you.
Yeah, and I don't want to criticize. 'cause
Yeah,
it's a-
but it is an amazing,
And it's not right where you would naturally find most plants in an arboretum. You have to walk away down into, but yeah, that's a good thing. And the other thing is you're not there when it's blooming unless you really know for sure
Yep, you gotta-
what's gonna be blooming there. You have to, time it really well to
yeah.
get to there. Any other questions?
Your advantages over your deciduous versus your evergreen azaleas. You've chosen this fewer number of deciduous to present, but what, is there an advantage one over the other?
Well, they're just two kind of different things, and it depends on your interest and your aesthetic appreciation. I think that, I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, the azalea city, and kind of got to know azaleas as just common as it could be, and didn't really fully appreciate them because they were so common. And now that I've seen some of the better displays of those, although they're Asian species, they're spectacular. I have one of them right in the front of my house because it's sort of, I like it. And, but to me, this whole group has characteristics that just feed me, and that's what, and there's so many other things too, and I just haven't had time to do those. So maybe one day I'll get back to them. If you really want to see azaleas of the non-deciduous ones, go to Winter Thur Gardens in Delaware at 1st of May. And you wouldn't believe it. And if it's a good year, it's just, acres of the woods filled with azaleas in all color.
You can stay
Spectacular.
closer and go to Southern Highlands Reserve at Lake Toxaway and see the Gregory Bald azaleas in there as well, if you get a reservation, because it is by group appointment only.
Now you're talking about,
Southern Highlands Reserve,
And-
Toxaway,
right, you're not talking about Gregory Bald itself.
Gregory Bald azaleas.
Okay, so, yeah, just to make a distinction, Gregory Bald is a place in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park that if you have the stamina and the time to go on a long hike to get there third week of June, you won't ever forget that because it's spectacular. And many of those have been brought into cultivation at the place that you're talking about. I had forgotten about that. I'm glad you reminded me. That's a good point. Well, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you, Alan. Just two quick things. In 15 minutes, our keynote speech from Mr. Preston Montague is going to be in here. If you want